This is Black Market Leadership, the underground resource for disruptors and status quo breakers.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Black Market Leadership, the home of disruptors and status quo breakers. You know, audience, as you know, I've interviewed guests such as Colonel Douglas McGregor. I mean, really, probably the one of the smartest guys in the U.S. No, not one of the, probably the smartest man in the military right now, who's given just a fantastic analysis, especially the Ukraine-Russian war. I've interviewed Michael Scheuer, the man that Bin Laden read. Scheuer was the guy who said we're fighting the war incorrectly. Interviewed Donald Vandegrift, the author of Adopting Mission Command, a real reformer, someone who wanted to transform the way how the Army fights. Interviewed Scott Horton, head of the Libertarian Institute, and of course, Carol Roth, whose New York Times bestselling author wrote The War on Small Business. What do all these people have in common? They're all disruptors. And my next guest, as you've already heard his bio, is Roger Hill, author of Dog Company, a true story of American soldiers abandoned by their high command. Roger, it is a pleasure to meet you, my friend.
Hey, great to be here, Kevin. Thank you for having me.
So first of all, okay, we're just going to bring us out now that we're talking. You and I have some connections. One is we have your friend Clubber Lang was my roommate back in the Army 20 years ago. Oh my God, the days. Michael Langster, for listening to this, Roger has nothing but great things to say about you. And also, you and I, Roger, have Pat Haddock. He is VMI class of 2000. He's one who introduced you and I, because we talk all the time. He's like, man, I know this guy, Roger Hill. You got to read his book. It's fantastic. And it goes in line to what a lot of things that I'm really interested in. And the fact is, I'm interested in America succeeding, flourishing, being successful. And from some of the interviews that I've watched you, Roger, talk about, the way I think our officer corps, or at least our leadership, treats our soldiers and officers is not the best. It's actually, well, you know firsthand it's not. For the audience here, you got to pick up his book. You got to read it, and I'll have links to it. So I'm going to jump into this full force. Roger, if an 18-year-old male soldier, female, or excuse me, an 18-year-old male or female comes up to you and says, you know what, I want to join the Army. What do you feel? What are you feeling? And what are you going to say?
That's a great question. It would depend. I think there are a lot of people for which the military can be a real step up from a very difficult set of circumstances. And the military has really helped turn a lot of people's lives around. And that's not the end goal per se. But, you know, we all leverage or utilize different opportunities to better ourselves. And the military has done that for a lot of people, in conjunction with providing a critical service to our country and our people. But on the whole, I mean, if you're asking me that, you know, and if I didn't know the person or anything about their circumstances, I would say absolutely not.
Unfortunately, I share that same, I guess, I don't know, that same feeling. I really do, because I care about, you know, I want this country to survive, to flourish. And given what's happening in the past, oh my God, I mean, look at your case. I mean, we're talking, what, 15 years ago, approximately 15. And look at it in the recent 2 or 3 years. We have a woke military, woke army. We're not meeting recruitment. And I think if you look back in history, tell me what, I'd love to hear your opinion on this. I think we're almost at the level of unpreparedness that we were in 1939. Prior to World War II. I know there's a difference. You know, back then we had 180,000 soldiers. Now we have 1.1 million in the military. But we just don't have the combat power, the fighting force that we need. And I think a lot of this is cultural. And going to what you wrote in Dog Company, man, what a heck of a story! What a heck of a story. So I want to jump into this. And instead of me just asking you to build up to this, tell me if I'm correct in this. You are a West Point graduate of class of 2000. You spent one tour in Iraq. You got a CIB, which is the Combat Infantry badge, Infantryman's badge. You got a Bronze Star. You're an engineer. And we're going to talk about that later. And then you ultimately went to Afghanistan with the 101st Airborne. You were a company commander of Dog Company, also known as Delta Company. You were sent to a province, Wardak province. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So a tour to Korea up near the DMZ with a mechanized infantry battalion, 19 when they were there. And that was just right after 9/11 occurred. And then a few years later to Iraq, to a few different places, but mostly in northern and western Iraq, Al-Anbar, all the way up to Mosul, down to Beji. And I was on a military transition team, but bounced around because I was one of the few combat arms guys in our larger group of about 120, and was in Al-Anbar and in Ramadi specifically during the kickoff of the surge in '06, and then back to the U.S., PCS to to Fort Campbell to the 101st, and took on a company command and went to Afghanistan from there in 2008.
So you were in, for the audience here, you were in, I've listened to other interviews with you. And by the way, I've read a quarter of your book. I apologize, I haven't finished it. Fantastic book, audience. You got to get it. Oh, and oh my God, you have Sean Hannity, Glenn Beck. You have all these testimonials, man. Wow. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
So the place you went to, your higher command thought it was not, am I wrong? They thought it was not a hot area, that it would be pretty calm given the size of your unit?
That's right. So one of the greater sins of today's strategy for fighting is one, counterinsurgency, which is not really a way of fighting. It's sort of what happens when you don't lead well in the beginning of a conflict and you end up in what's called a counterinsurgency. And so we've somehow managed to glorify what that is. But inside of that, there's what's called a economy of force mission. It's the area that you leave rather uncovered so that you can focus your forces because you have a lack of resources. So it's basically a prioritization, and we were the unit that had the area of least priority because it was believed the enemy was not really in that area or aiming to influence that area. And what it turned out to be is, as we pushed out into the hinterlands and really tried to understand what was in our area of responsibilities, that actually that area was a rest and refit for the enemy. They were operating in other places, but they were totally resting and refitting. So when we went in, we really kicked up a hornet's nest, and our area, the whole paradigm flipped for us. Like our battalion had infantry companies and other areas around us, tens of dozens of miles away in different areas of responsibility where the enemy was mostly focused. But then what happened is that our area became more kinetic because we were all of a sudden in their backyard where they were trying to recuperate and reset and base their operations out of. So we kind of made a mess of things when we went into Wardak that year.
It sounds like, for all you history buffs out there, was Operation Market Garden, where 101st, 82nd, and the 1st British Airborne jump on Arnhem. When they go to Arnhem Bridge, that's the ultimate goal. But it's a rest and refitting for the Nazis. But they happen to have 2 SS divisions rest and refitting there. So wow. Yeah. So when you say kinetic, you mean actively, literally, they're shooting. They're throwing kinetic energy at you, bullets, all the time.
Yeah, there wasn't a patrol that went out. It was very rare. And we were sending patrols out daily, multiple times a day, that we weren't ambushed. And that's really the kind of the irony of how the military began to fight during the global war on terror. It was go out, probe, look to be hit, and then engage and follow up and collect intelligence that would hopefully lead you to, some bigger fish or some bigger catch. But that's kind of how we operated. We were always out. Almost, it felt like bait, getting hit over and over again on patrol, and then just hoping that we would have some breakthrough on the intelligence we collected through that patrol. But 6 months in, we had taken over a couple dozen casualties, not killed in action per se, but a lot of guys wounded, returned to duty, and a couple of guys killed.
Were you're wounded? Were they from kinetic? Were they from fire, from booby traps? What was? I'm not trying to get gruesome. I'm worried about the ratio.
No, it's fair. And it's been enough time where, it doesn't really affect me as much to talk about. But lots of RPG initiated ambushes, 10 to 12 enemy foot soldier size, guys who are riding on motorbikes, scooters, rolling up to a side of a major supply route that we were moving along, and hitting us with armor piercing RPGs. If they could, they would initiate, with an IED. And then I would say maybe 20% of the wounded that we took were from indirect attacks, tons of 107 rockets, 82 millimeter mortars, and that was more to terrorize us at night so we wouldn't get sleep. So like during the day while we were out, and then also, at night while we were trying to sleep.
What was the difference between Iraq and Afghanistan?
Another great question. I can answer that way better now with some time under my belt. The infrastructure, at least in the areas that I was in Iraq, was much better. So we could get to things and sustain ourselves better as a fighting force, which means we could partner with the local national force. Now, whether they reacted or responded well is a whole different story, but in theory, we were set up for greater success in that way. In Afghanistan, that was less the case. One of the things I realized, though, on a much greater or higher strategic level, when concerning success or potential for success in Iraq versus Afghanistan, is that in Iraq, we had built a huge detention facility, and I'm trying to think of the name of the city that detention facility was in. Starts with a B, if I'm not mistaken.
Badr?
Maybe further down south, but huge detention facility with a lot of beds, a lot of capacity. And so when we kicked off the surge and we pulled people off the streets, we actually had a place to put them so that we could then, kind of quelch the violence and begin to really influence the area without the meddling or the sabotage of having those people back on the streets to interfere. In Afghanistan, I didn't realize this when we were in Afghanistan, but people would joke that there was a revolving door detention type dynamic at play. And it was very much the case where we would often capture people, like even for us, when you read the book, we'd be in an ambush and we'd take wounded enemy fighters off the battlefield, drive them back to our base through IED, riddled routes, sometimes ambushed again on the way back home after an ambush, and told that we didn't have enough evidence to keep them. And literally, we've got tourniquets on a guy's arms, after we've taken him off the battlefield. But because we're the witnesses, that the evidence wasn't strong enough, or we weren't providing enough evidence, to the standards that were being pursued or promoted at that time. And so what I found out, though, is that a lot of this was actually kind of a gamesmanship of sorts. The higher command didn't really want to make it public that we didn't have capacity to take detainees in. And so they just pushed really hard, pushed back on the ground forces when they took detainees off the battlefield, and made us return them, because there wasn't a place to take them. And so there was, in fact, a revolving door. And that's why there was such a high circulation of enemy fighters coming off the battlefield and being put right back on the battlefield, circulated back into the fight over and over again. And that really complicated things and made things more difficult in Afghanistan over Iraq, especially given how little emphasis and how much less resources we were being given to fight in Afghanistan over Iraq.
It's if I remember right, the incident that you mentioned right there was a time where you again, for the audience here, just to understand the severity of this, 2 American soldiers were kidnapped and murdered, and bodies mutilated, horrible. Yeah. And one of the guys, the guy you're talking about, was they ambushed you. You ran through the ambush, you blew his arm off, or your unit blew his arm off. You had to take him back, fix him up. And because those past 4 days, the higher command said, not only do you have to take him back to his starting point, you got to give him cash as well. Is that right?
Yeah, no, Yeah, you're remembering this better than me because you just read the story. But yeah, very accurate depiction of what happened. So yes, on one hand, we fought through an ambush that we did not initiate. One of our platoons, we captured an enemy fighter. We had, we're a heavy weapons company, so when we're shooting back with Mark 19s and 50 cal on every vehicles, one or the other. And the backup is a 240. So when we engaged, people tended to lose body parts. So this guy had lost an arm in this firefight. We did the humane thing, which was, as we were pushing through the objective to clear it, we picked him up, put a tourniquet on him, put him in our truck, brought him back. He was in critical shape. So we had to keep him a few days to stabilize him on our fob before we sent him forward. In Afghanistan, at that time, we were under, and we still were for many years before and after, we were under NATO. And so the ISAF, which was the command that we fought under, was the military arm of NATO at that time in Afghanistan, and they had a different set of rules of engagement that we fought with in Iraq. And so you're reminding me of one of the major differences between Iraq and Afghanistan. It's just the ROE based on the commands that we fell under. In Afghanistan at that time, you had 4 days to get someone processed and into the big detention facility, which did not exist. Little did we know. So because we held this enemy fighter who had been wounded nearly to the point of death, past 4 days, when we tried to send him forward, they said, you're outside the 4-day window. And they sent him back to us on a bird. So we flew him up with a Black Hawk. They flew him back with a Black Hawk. And they said, hey, you need to give him cab fare, take him to the nearest taxi stop, and send him on his way.
And the irony is when actually we're going to get into this, but investigators came up to interview you, and I think 12 Blackhawks came a couple of days later.
Oh yeah, I mean, just wave after wave of Blackhawks to drop CID. And yeah, you're right. Towards the end of this story, when there's an investigation against me for trying to take care of my guys, all of a sudden there were resources galore. But yeah, juxtapose what you just said or what you just shared as an example with from looking at it from the other perspective. In the same valley, Tangi Valley, Tangi, and folks will remember this valley from a firefight in 2010. I think there was a Chinook with like 22 SEALs shot down. And so this was a valley that was in our area of responsibility, just a really hairy place. But when we were there, it was 2008. Right. And so not a lot of forces on the ground because people didn't realize how bad it was. So in that same area, there was a National Guard unit from New York that was passing through with a 3-vehicle convoy. We were probably an hour and 15 minutes away as a QRF if something happened. And we received an SOS via text message. So we got it kind of late because that's not a platform that we check very often. So we were maybe even an hour late to even seeing the message itself because it's a non-standard way of sending communications in theater. And by the time we mustered and got into that valley, all 3 vehicles of that convoy were smoldering, had melted through the asphalt into the bedrock of the road. Ammo casings everywhere, U.S. military uniform items, like pieces of uniform everywhere. Bodies burning in vehicles. And then we discovered with other units that were showing up, mostly, letter agencies and special operators that were on the ground, that we were missing 2 U.S. personnel. And so that turned into a recovery operation for several days. And we ended up finding body parts of one service member in a field some distance away. And we discovered a dismembered body where the arms had been sawed off of a service member and his heart taken out of his chest. So, just you juxtapose those 2 examples against one another, and it's just insanity, right? To think about what we were being asked to do and the standard that we were being held to relative to, the enemy.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier the ROE. So for the audience, audience probably guess the military is laden with acronyms. ROE, they're rules of engagement. Our enemies don't have any. And you mentioned, the 2 bodies, and it's just horrible, especially the heart cavity. I know too that you've talked about that you heard later on through intelligence that one of the victims' fingers were being sold at a bazaar. Is that right? As souvenirs or something like that?
Yeah. And so, me being a typical conventional combat arms guy had never really dealt with a lot of the assets that poured in. Once this became a missing in action operation and a recovery activity, we had like a ridiculous level of assets pour in, things that I never knew it existed. And so we had the capability to listen to communications in that entire region. And so some of the printouts that we had of things that were being said were the Taliban basically, bragging to one another that they were taking the fingers of the service member, probably the guy who was missing his arms, to the local bazaar to sell the different fingers, as war trophies. That was literally happening in 2008.
So your arms are tied behind you with rules of engagement, just ridiculous rules of engagement. And I've seen so many interviews. Clint Howard, that's one of the gentlemen I've seen. Is that right, Clint Howard? I've seen him on Fox and his family several times.
Okay.
That's a guy who the 3 motorcycle riders came up. It was in a dangerous valley. His unit fired on him.
Clint Lawrence.
I'm totally off. Okay.
Very close. No, you're very close. Yeah.
So these people are in jail for doing what in Korea or World War II was normal, was expected. You're there to win. So you've mentioned before, I think you said this really, really, it was very intelligent observation that we are using criminal justice systems in a war zone. And that's really the essence of Dog Company, in the fact that your unit had spies in it. They were betraying you. They were getting your people killed, and you had to uncover the spies. In fact, you had intelligence assets around you that were supporting you. You could pinpoint them, but you had an arbitrary timeline. Was it 4 days? Is that right?
96 hours. That's right. 4 days.
4 days to uncover them, almost like you're a prosecutor in New York City. This is the war zone.
Yeah. To me, and this was after having had some time to think about this and process it. So, at that time, I could not have articulated or argued as well for myself. But really what this all comes down to, and after having heard you, just lead into our interview here, I feel like you're going to really line up well with this, is when you don't go into a conflict holding the moral high ground, then this is the sort of shit that happens. Right?
Yeah.
So in these other conflicts, like World War II or Korea, we held a moral high ground. And so we did what was necessary to take care of business on the ground. And everybody looked at that and said, yep, I'm okay with that. I approve of it. And I want to see more of it. And so that was the culture. That was the norm, the status quo in these wars that our country, and this is part of like what you were asking about earlier. So like if parents of a young person come to me, which they do on occasion because of the platform and the notoriety of the story, and they say, what do you think? I say, did you know? And I won't even answer the question right away, but I'll just say, hey, did you know that like our military is in 130 different countries right now? Did you know that we're spread across approximately 900 different bases right now? Like, do you have any idea what we're really being used for right now? Like, do you understand that I should have Chevron and Exxon and BP as sponsorships on my uniform for the type of dirty work that I've been doing? Like, I should have a kickback or, a subsidy that's pouring in as an annuity in perpetuity, in my bank account for the work that I've done for our country and for the petro that, I was leveraged for to secure. Like, when I start getting into those sorts of discussions, people's minds just explode and they either turn around and walk away, or, we really have a nice long conversation over time, because they're being red pilled at the moment, right? Just specifically about our government and our military in that way. But yeah, like it.
I hear you. You said something earlier that I got to bring an example up, because you mentioned, it's different from the Second World War. General Curtis LeMay bombed Tokyo. It's called the fire bombings. And one night, Roger, he killed 100,000 people outright.
Yeah.
Men, women, children. It was total war. Do you know what the culture did, the American culture? In New York Times, raving reviews. This man is ending this war. And as Michael Scheuer, one of the guests once said, the only mercy in war is speed. You go there, you win, you fight, you kill, and you win, and you get the hell out. And the stuff that you, especially in Afghanistan, it's a moral travesty. It's a moral travesty. And I personally thank you for your service and all you went through. And we're going to get into this very, very soon, because I want the audience to realize how you and your soldiers were betrayed. It's heart-wrenching, and there has to be major, major institutional changes, I think. So let's go back to Afghanistan. You have spies. You have intelligence. You've pinpointed who they are. You've arrested them, detained them, and you have 4 days. Time's running out. What happens?
Yeah, and could I just add to a little bit of the context there too?
Please.
Yeah, so one of the spies that we discovered was my personal translator. So that's devastating, because that guy or that girl, whoever it is that serves in that capacity, is the lifeline of communication for all operations, especially in this context, because one of our main objectives is to partner with and train the local national force to take over for us. So I lean so heavily, if not most heavily, on that translator. All of these local nationals that we discovered were spies were all hired by the U.S. military's acquisition process. They were allegedly vetted using air quotes here, by our procurement process, our security screening process. They were all dirty. And the other part of this too was that my higher level command was actually tracking all this for weeks and didn't disclose it to me. And we didn't find that out till after the fact.
Oh my God.
So they knew, so they knew, for whatever their reasons were. Maybe they had some legitimate reasons to let an op run for a period of time, but these spies had SIM cards, phones hidden on the base. They were calling out and reporting on us as we were leaving for operations. And so that's why, when I was describing earlier how some of these ambushes were unfolding, we were showing up to areas and we were being ambushed on the way in, ambushed on the way out. And it's because people knew we were coming, and they were, basically just lining up to take a shot at us on the way in and way out.
Your personal translator, I mean, that's the guy right next to you. He hears everything.
Does.
Oh my God. So what happened?
Yeah. So the rules of engagement that we described earlier in Afghanistan, different than Iraq. This is one of the reasons why Iraq saw better success, if you want to put it that way. I mean, all of it's a mess, just a different kind of mess in a different place. Yeah. And, just so I'm very clear, we never should have been in either country.
I agree.
Yeah. And if if you want to get into that, we can too, but we didn't have the moral high ground. We didn't have the right justification to be in either place. But 4-day turnaround on enemy combatants that you took off the battlefield in Afghanistan. We took these spies off the battlefield. The unit that was supposed to come pick them up, that was a part of the op, did not come to pick them up. And so we didn't have the resources, because we were such a small company. So literally 89 people, right, spread out across 4 different bases, 3 outposts, 1 forward operating base. We just didn't have the capacity in the vehicles, the Humvees that we had, to load up this many detainees and then take them to Kabul for them to be processed. And even if we had, I didn't know this at the time, but there wasn't any room at the inn anyway. So they were just going to get pushed back to us anyhow. We also had very strong intel. And just for context, if you've heard of or seen the movie/documentary called Outpost, that occurred, that platoon outpost, where I think nearly 30 soldiers were wounded and or killed, had occurred that summer. And it was basically a platoon outpost being overrun because of an insider threat. So that sort of thing was happening that summer in 2008. And I was very much aware of it because I was tracking intel closely. And when we found out that we had an insider threat that spread throughout our entire network, not just my base, but potentially the other outposts as well, I took it very seriously. When my higher command would not take these enemy spies off of our hands, then I went into action. I started to interrogate them myself, and I wasn't gentle.
Well, if I remember right, you said slapping's involved, but with George C. Patton or George C. Scott say as Patton, what's that in comparison to the war? I mean, a slap or two, give me a freaking break compared to what they're doing to American soldiers.
Agreed.
And so you took the initiative, you took control, and you did it yourself. Is that what the charges were against you? That you literally overstepped your boundaries?
That's right. So I don't have, in that capacity as an infantry company commander, I don't have the, I guess the
prerogative.
Yeah, it's not my call. I don't have the right certifications or training authority to interrogate in that way. I can do some very basic interrogations, and we were trained on some of this coming in, of course. But what I needed was to save lives, and I didn't have the resources because we were the quote unquote economy of force mission, right? I mean, they couldn't even provide trans to get 12 spies off my base. We knew were like, this was incontrovertible evidence through signals intelligence platforms that don't lie. And so, when I did those interrogations, we had a lieutenant that had just been killed in an IED initiated ambush about a week prior. His replacement had just arrived, and he caught wind of or had heard that there were interrogations being run that were beyond my authority. And so he got on his cell phone and called the battalion commander directly. And that launched what's called a 15-6, which is sort of the beginning of a formal inquiry, into malfeasance or, believed suspected malfeasance. And that turned into an Article 32, which is kind of like a civilian grand jury equivalent, but under UCMJ.
A civilian grand jury.
It's the equivalent of, you have an investigating officer who sits over it, kind of like an adjudicating authority, but it's set up with a prosecution, a defense. We had media in attendance, and then you have this investigating officer who really goes in deep to understand what's happened, and then has authority to interview whoever he wants from both sides. And then, legal representation is assigned as well. So that Article 32 happened that fall of 2008 after I was relieved from command. And so that's kind of the military, the military or the legal component of the story, if you will.
If you like this content and want to hear other things like it, head on over to the website at blackmarketleadership.com. That's blackmarketleadership.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, and you can even create a free members profile